Is James Paxton coming back to Seattle? Ryan Divish says pump the brakes, but we'll talk about the possibility nonetheless, or if the Mariners could aim even bigger in the rotation with a trade for White Sox ace Dylan Cease. All that and more coming up here on Locked On Mariners. Colby, hit it.
You are Locked On Mariners, your daily Seattle Mariners podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ahoy, sailors. It is Wednesday, January 3rd, 2024. This is Ty Gonzalez and Colby Patnode for the Locked On Mariners podcast, brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. And right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on. That's LOCKDON to get yourself started. Thank you so much for making us your first listen, subscribe, like, and turn on alerts if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform if you like what you hear. And if you're part of the crew and rock with us every single day, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you want to hear from us even more, please consider signing up for our Patreon. You can now get a free 7-day trial to check out the show. The link, as well as our social accounts, is in the description of this episode. Today's episode is all about pitching. We're going to talk James Paxton and Dylan Cease, and over the course of that, we'll discuss how adding a pitcher impacts the rest of the Mariners roster build. We're going to start with Paxton. Is the Big Maple coming back to Seattle? That's what a lot of Mariners fans are wondering after Canadian reporter Chad Day, who's broken pretty much every piece of James Paxton related news over the past few years, tweeted on Monday that Paxton was in attendance at the NHL Winter Classic game between the Kraken and the Golden Knights at T-Mobile Park, and was even watching the game from the Mariners owner's suite. So naturally, that sent a lot of fans into a frenzy on social media. Paxton's obviously a fan favorite, so a lot of fans would be very excited about that. But this morning, we need to mention Ryan Divish of the Seattle Times said he reached out to Paxton, who told him that the Mariners have actually not contacted him this offseason, but he would love to make a reunion happen. So who knows? So Colby, we talked about this on our Patreon show yesterday. It does seem like Chad Day's tweet was a bit overblown, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Mariners won't eventually circle around to Paxton this offseason. So what do you think of that possibility?
Yeah, as predicted, Mariners Twitter went into overdrive after the tweet, and as predicted, it was a nothing burger. Although Ty certainly played it up.
Chad Day has been pretty accurate on Paxton related stuff recently. I'm just saying,
but
I felt like there might be an actual reason that he.
Let's just say one of us was a lot more skeptical than the other one, and that person was proven right. Shortly after we ended recording yesterday,
more optimistic. So. I'm just saying.
Sure, I mean more realistic, but
sure.
I love James Paxton. He's a great dude by all accounts, and obviously he really cares about the Mariners and it just in general. Like he cares about the fan base and whatnot. I'm not surprised to hear that. Like he would love to come back. I'm not surprised, honestly, that he would be in Seattle for an event like this. I think that makes a lot of sense. Paxton has a house in Kirkland, I think. Bellevue. He has a house in a suburb of Seattle. And he also obviously he's from British Columbia. So he's a Pacific Northwest guy, pretty much through and through. So, a lot of this makes sense, right? That he would like to pitch for Seattle again. Yeah. He, would go to this big event that's happening in Seattle, when he already lives near there and all of that. So, good to hear James is doing well. I really like the guy, but there's really no question about it that there are some pretty, pretty alarming red flags about this idea in general. Not the least of which is that Frankie Montas just got $16 million for an inning pitched in 2023. And the pitching market is really doing what we thought the hitters market would do, where the pitching market is actually getting contracts that are
so weird because that's the actual saturated group.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And yet Lucas Giolito's getting $19 million a year and coming off of two terrible years. And, like I said, Montas just threw an inning and he got $15 million. Like
Severino got 13 mil.
Yeah. So Paxton's going to be looking for at least that. And what we know about the Mariners payroll situation is that It's not unlimited. It's not even close to what they thought it was going to be. And so we don't know what the exact number left is, but if you're having to pay James Paxton conservatively $13 to $15 million, maybe more, because Paxton was actually okay last year, and he threw close to 100 innings, which some of these guys didn't do, and they're getting $13-15 million. So, like, even if he gives you a deal and you get him for $10 million, like, that's a lot of your budget, presumably, that you just gave to a pitcher that you can't really trust to stay healthy all that much. So it's not a super easy fit. It's not, a no-brainer. And there are some big red flags. That being said, I love James Paxton, and I'm never going to get mad at the Mariners for signing James Paxton. So a little bit of a gray area for me. I'm not going to be totally objective about this because, again, Big Maple is awesome. And
Right.
I do think he could help this team. I really do. It's just a matter of, is it the smartest allocation of resources? If the Mariners have as few resources as we've kind of been led to believe, then I would say it's really borderline. It's really tough to see them sign Paxton and still get the impact elsewhere that they need. So
yeah,
I'm on the fence about it. I just, in a pure vacuum, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to give, really any pitcher $15 million to be like the number 4 or number 5. But there are certainly scenarios where that could come into play and where that could work out. And we'll talk about them a little bit later. But yeah, James, I just don't see the fit right now as things stand. And even if there was a fit, could you do a little bit better for the 15, maybe a little bit safer or a little bit just better in general? Like, you probably could. So I don't know. I'm on the fence with Paxton. Like I said, I'd love to have him here, but I just don't think that the resource allocation is going to make sense for the Mariners to seriously pursue him.
Yeah, we'll get more into the resource allocation stuff in just a little bit. But, on Paxton, like you, I'm biased. I love James Paxton. I was there for his no-hitter. Like, I have a pretty special connection with Paxton as a fan of the team. So, like, always going to be a huge fan of the Big Maple. Would love for him to come back under really any circumstance. This year made his return from injury. Obviously had the injury in the first game that he pitched back with the Mariners in 2021. As a result, he missed all of 2022. Came back in May this year with the Red Sox, 96 innings pitched, 9.47 Ks per 9, 309 walks per 9, 4.50 ERA, 4.68 FIP. Those numbers look a lot better if you remove his last 3 starts of the year. And Colby, there's some numbers that you went over on the Patreon show. I don't know if you have them pulled up again, if you do, or if you remember them off the top of your head. I'd love to have you, read those out, because I think there's some thought there that he could still be like absolute ceiling, like probably not. He's probably like an actual like number 4, but absolute ceiling, he could still be like a low end 3, right?
Yeah. I watched some of his starts the other day because it was New Year's Day and that holiday sucks. So I went back, I looked at some of his starts, and I was going to watch more just in case this turned out to be something, but obviously it didn't. But based on what I saw, Paxton still looks like a legitimate, at least a number 4, probably a number 3. I saw starts where he was 94 to 97 with a really strong cutter, slider, the pitch that we never figured out what it actually was, and a pretty good curveball. So he was throwing strikes that obviously based on the K per 9. The thing that really got him was the home run to fly ball rate last year. It was at 17.8%, I think is what it was. Like, that's obviously super inflated over what it normally is, but Paxton still misses bats. He still has good stuff. He still throws plenty of strikes. Like, it's a number 4 starter. I feel really comfortable about Paxton being a number 4 starter. For how many innings? I don't know. So that's kind of the red flag there. But what I saw from healthy James Paxton last year was that this dude's still a middle of the rotation arm at least. So yeah, I mean, he's still throwing hard. Like I said, the cutter still has bite, still has that kind of overhand curveball that he flips in there for strikes. Like, he's a good pitcher still. He can definitely help a team.
For sure. So we're going to talk about Dylan Cease. We're going to talk about resource allocation when it comes to pitching for the Mariners, and if that's the best route for them to take this off season when building out the rest of the roster for 2024. We'll go over all of that in just a moment. But first, a reminder, this episode of the Locked On Mariners podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. All right, Sailors, the NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use, and there are so many different ways to bet, like live same-game parlays. You can also find bets in the new Explore tab and make a parlay in the Parlay Hub. It's the best way to find popular parlays. And with football coming to a close, you know what that means. Mariners baseball is almost here, folks, and so is betting on Mariners baseball. But while you wait for the boys to take the field, you can still bet on the Seahawks, Kraken, and Huskies basketball and football. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/LOCKEDON to make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the National Football League. And you're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Thank you again for making us your first listen. And as a reminder, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And folks, on Friday, it is Fan Fiction Friday, of course. Well, barring any moves, we always have to add that little caveat. So barring any moves by the Mariners, Fan Fiction Friday on Friday, we will have a form in the description of this show, whether you're listening on podcast platforms or watching on YouTube. You can click that link, go to the Google form, and submit your Mariners trade proposals. And we will try to read and grade as many as we can on Friday's show. So, as you mentioned, Colby, earlier when we were talking about Paxton, with the way that the pitching market has gone lately, I don't see any way that, even with his injury concerns, even with his age, even with the fact that he only threw 96 innings this past year, he's not getting, at minimum, less than $10 million.
Yeah.
Like, I feel pretty confident, seeing what some of these other pitchers have gotten, that he's going to make at least 13 from whoever he signs with. Now, we know, or at least we assume, that the Mariners have a very, very restricted payroll right now. All indications, or all signs point to that being the case, right? And there's been reports about them only having about $20 to $25 million, and that was before the Mitch Garver signing. So we don't know how that contract is structured, right? And thank you, John Stanton, for making us worry about a 2-year, $24 million contract, if that's backloaded, and what the opt-out is in 2026 and all that stuff. So silly, but that's the point we're at. Every $1 million counts right now. So we don't know if that's $8 million into what they can spend for 2024. We don't know if that's $10 million. We don't know if it's just $12 million, how you would think with the way that the contract is laid out. 2 years, $24 million. He gets 12 this year. He gets 12 next year. Who knows? We don't know. But Paxton gets like $13 million. Or say he does give you a deal and you get him for like 11.5. That's presumably a significant chunk of the remaining resources you have at your disposal. Does that seem like the smartest route for the Mariners to take this offseason? Or can they get to a point where that becomes the smartest route they can take this offseason?
If they can acquire essentially the Bryce Miller and Brian Wu of offense while giving up only one of those guys, then maybe. But it's hard for me to imagine, because like I don't know off the top of my head who that guy is. Like, is it Matt McClain and Bryce Miller, like, or is Noel V. Marte and Brian Wu? Is it something like that? Like, if you could get those two guys and then you replace, then you add two bats to your starting lineup who are making the league minimum, then yeah, you could in theory. Or maybe it's just one guy who's making the league minimum and another guy who's making like $10 million. Maybe it's a Rosarena and Royce Lewis. I don't know. Right. Like, if it's those two guys and one cost you Miller and the other one cost you Wu, then yeah, spending the money on a pitcher would make some sense. But you kind of have to, it's triage right now, right? For the Mariners, you kind of have to do the best you can with what you have available to you, and allocating that much money. Like if Garver comes in at 10, right? Just to play it safe. If he comes in at 10, then we think maybe the Mariners at the high end have $25-ish million left to play with at the high end. You're gonna give 15 of that to Paxton. Let's say Paxton gives you a deal. All right. He gives you 12 million.
You're going to give him half of what you have left.
You're going to give half and you still need bullpen arms. You still need another bat. You still need a bench bat. Like it gets very tight very quick. So now what you're having to do is in order to pay for Paxton, you're probably having to trade like Ty France. But the issue with that is that now who plays first base? Now I've just added to another position. Now I have another position I have to add to a position group that I already have some depth at, like reasonable depth at. So it's a really tough balancing act, and so that's why it's tough for me to imagine that you can get Paxton signed to a number that he'll take without it costing you a pretty significant bat upgrade. Because I would rather, in a vacuum, I'd rather have James Paxton than Adam Duvall for the Mariners this year. This Mariners team roster, as it's currently constructed, Duvall makes way more sense than James Paxton.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of the tight, the tight window you're trying to thread right now. Like you're trying to throw a tire through a football through a tire swing that's moving at 100 miles an hour. If you sign James Paxton, like, good luck. You can maybe do it, but it's going to be really hard.
Yeah. I saw some takes, some tweets, whatever, after the Chad Day tweet came out. A lot of people saying like, well, this doesn't necessarily like have to be a precursor to a Miller or Woo trade if they sign Paxton. And you're right, it doesn't necessarily have to be that, because they have depth issues in their rotation right now, especially with the question marks of Emerson Hancock and Brian Woo. And beyond those two guys, like we talked about, I think on Monday, Darren McCacken's like your number 7 right now. So they do have some depth issues. It's not the worst idea in the world to start Brian Woo in AA or AAA to manage him that way. You could run a 6-man rotation to manage the innings of your top guys and Miller and Woo at the back end. There's a lot of different things that you could do, right? That do make sense on the surface. But it kind of has to be a precursor to a trade with the way that the Mariners are currently constructed and what they have available to them in terms of money. Because if you're giving James Paxton half of your available funds, or even more, if it's 3/4 of what you have available to you, you're not going to be able to build the offense that you need, quite frankly, without trading Miller or Woo. Like, just straight up, again, love James Paxton. Would love having him back really under any circumstance, just from the biased James Paxton fan that I am, but also the logical baseball analyst that I am would hate it, because James Paxton, for this particular roster, to join the fray of Bryce Miller, Brian Woo, Emerson Hancock, to essentially be that number 5 behind Miller, or number 6 if they went with a 6-man rotation, that's not worth $13 or $15 million. It's not at all. Not to the Mariners specifically.
Yeah.
So that's one issue that I have with. And also, I would feel differently about a Paxton signing depending on who they traded. Right? Because if you trade Miller, then you're talking about your number 4 and number 5 spots coming down to some combination of James Paxton, Brian Woo, and Emerson Hancock, who all 3 of those guys, you can't really feel super confident in them giving you 100+ innings. I think Woo more so than the other 2 because of Paxton's long injury history, and Hancock has another shoulder thing that's going on. For Woo, it's mostly just about getting further and further removed from Tommy John, but even then we saw him get pretty gassed out there towards the end of the season. Does that have an impact on 2024, on the start of his 2024? This also adds more validity to the possibility of starting him in AA or AAA and managing his innings and buying yourself some more time to kind of ease him back into things. So there's a lot of question marks with that. And so I would feel a lot more negatively about a Paxton signing if they traded Miller. And now my number 4, number 5, again, is some combination of those 3 guys, at least until the summer when Robbie Ray might be a factor. And we don't know if Robbie Ray is going to be a factor. There might be setbacks. A lot of people are just kind of assuming that Robbie Ray is going to come back and he's going to be Robbie Ray. There is no guarantee of that whatsoever this summer. So do I think that those guys could help buy you some time to get to July when Ray might be able to come back, or you can make a trade for another pitcher? Sure, but I don't feel great about that to start the season, quite frankly.
Yeah, because I mean, if you trade Miller, then it's 2 of those guys with only 1 in reserve. If you trade Woo, then it's it's 2 of those guys, not 3 of those guys. But also Miller is just a safer bet to give you 160, 170 innings, right? He also has less of an injury history, and the Mariners rotation in general, right as it sits right now, minus Brian Woo, pretty good health like histories. Even but again, Robbie Ray had a fantastic history.
You never know, man.
Posting. Yeah,
pitching is a very stressful thing on the body. It can happen to anyone at any given moment. That's what makes it so scary.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so valuable. So yeah, I think if I'm replacing, if I trade Bryce Miller, right, hypothetically, I'm looking for a different type of pitcher to replace him than if I trade Brian Wu. If I'm trading Brian Wu, I'm willing to take more of a risk. I'm just looking for upside. If I trade Bryce Miller, I need some relative certainty.
Yeah.
Because I'm counting on the innings that Bryce Miller in theory is.
And if that means that I'm getting a worse pitcher, so be it.
Yeah, I can't have 2 guys in my rotation at the same time who literally can't stay healthy.
And I also feel like I can get someone that can give me innings of like a 4.5 ERA. We're just using ERA because it's the simplest stat here. I can probably get that guy for like $5 million rather than pay James Paxton $15 million with all the question marks that come with him.
Sure. Alex Wood.
Yeah.
Johnny Cueto, somebody like that.
Yeah. You're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Thank you again for making us your first listen. So we've talked about the money aspect of, pouring more resources into your starting rotation. But what about trade assets, prospects? The Yapper is at it again, folks. John Morosi has linked the Mariners. Breaking news has linked the Mariners to yet another player out on the market. Doesn't matter if it's free agent or trade. He's linked the Mariners to pretty much every player in Major League Baseball at this point. Morosi mentioned the Mariners as a potential suitor for White Sox ace. I almost said Red Sox. White Sox ace Dylan Cease. He was on MLB Network yesterday talking about the Orioles as being essentially the front runners for Cease, who seems very likely is going to get traded at some point over the next couple of months. But he did throw in the Mariners there towards the end of his spiel because he clearly has some quota that he has to fill when it comes to the Mariners players. So the only reason we're talking about this is because, Colby, you had a Dylan Cease trade idea a while back. We talked about it on this show. So clearly you think that Cease is a potential fit for the Mariners. So what do you think about trading for Dylan Cease? And, your idea was kind of tied to also trading Logan Gilbert, but what if you don't trade Logan Gilbert? What if you just trade for Dylan Cease?
Yeah, Cease is obviously kind of the big pitcher that's out there right now on the trade market, especially now that Glass now is off the table, and apparently Chris Sale is out there too. So, Cease is kind of the biggest name, unless you are a Red Sox fan and you think you're entitled to George Kirby. Dylan Cease is the biggest trade chip available right now.
Nick York for George Kirby, of course.
Yep. Sure. At least he's the biggest guy who we know is being shopped. If Jesus Luzardo was being shopped, he might be the most, valuable arm out there. But Cease is a guy who we know is getting shopped. And we know he's likely to get traded sometime between now and whenever the trade deadline is this upcoming year. So he's the big name. He's what does it take to get him is my question, because I think it takes 2 of your top 5 two of your top 5 or 6, and then probably another like top 10-ish guy, and that's if they're willing to take just prospects. The White Sox might want young major leaguers. You look at what they did in their trade with the Braves for AJ, or not AJ Mentor, for
Aaron Bummer.
Aaron Bummer. Like they got a lot of bulk, but it was bulk that could play right away in theory. So maybe they say, yeah, sure, we'll trade you Dylan Cease, but we want Terry Ford and we want like Brian Wu. And it's at that point
Jose Caballero and Sam Haggerty for Dylan Cease.
Sure.
Chills.
Sure. But you know what I mean? Like they might want young major leaguers, and you just don't really have that to give unless you're giving Miller or Wu. And I guess you could give Wu, but 6 years of Wu for 2 years of Cease. I don't really see the point in that. Yeah. So unless they're willing to take a pure prospect package, maybe they love Dom Canzone. I guess you could put Canzone in the trade, but now you have to go out and get another outfielder. So
now I need 3 outfielders, or as Jerry DePetto would say, 2.5 outfielders.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know if there's a path here to a deal unless it's pure prospects. And even then, like if you're the Mariners and like how are you going to outbid the Orioles?
Yeah.
The Orioles need pitching badly, and they have young major leaguers who are like, they've already played in the big leagues.
They have a god tier prospect system right now.
Yeah. Like if you're the White Sox, would you rather have Harry Ford and Gabriel Gonzalez, or would you rather have Heston Kjerstad and Connor Norby? Like,
and maybe even more on top of that.
But those are just 2 guys. Like those guys are going to get at-bats a lot of at-bats for the White Sox this year. Ford
They've also had second base issues, so like Jordan Westbrook makes a lot of sense for them.
Yeah, so I don't see how you can actually outbid these teams unless the White Sox are looking 3 years down the road and they don't care so much about this year, which is totally possible because it's different to trade a reliever and a starting pitcher. They're just different markets.
Yeah.
So it's possible. I would say it's highly unlikely unless you're adding like a Brian Wu to your side of the deal. And at that point, does that really make that much sense for Seattle? Not really. So
the Orioles just make such a more compelling case for Cease.
Yeah. I mean, the Orioles make all the sense in the world for
the only question there is like Cease is only due like $8 million in arbitration, but is that too rich for the Orioles' blood right now? I mean, they did just give $13 million to Craig Kimbrell, which, like, if you have payroll limitations, you probably shouldn't give $13 million to a reliever.
Right.
But
yeah, I guess the other X factor would be like, do the Orioles even like Dylan Cease?
True.
Probably. I mean, they should, but
you kind of don't know ball if you don't like Dylan Cease, at least to a certain degree.
Sure. I mean, and again, if you're the Orioles, it's like, yeah, of course we'll give you Norby and Kjerstad and like, so one area you could maybe, scam the system a little bit is if you're willing to take on a bad contract from the White Sox. So like
because the Mariners have a ton of money to do that.
Exactly. So I mean, is Dylan Cease really worth taking on the $60 million remaining on Andrew Benintendi's contract? Is he plus the prospect capital you have to give up? Is he worth taking on I think $12 million Yohan Moncada is due this upcoming year? Probably not. And like you said, Cease is making like $8 million himself. So I don't see, unless the White Sox are willing to take a pure prospect package, or more or less. Like if they want you to throw in like Dylan Moore, like fine, whatever. But if they're willing to take a full, prospect package where it's Harry Ford, Gabriel Gonzalez, Michael Arroyo, and Michael Morales, like something like that, then I'm in. I'm interested.
Sure,
but I just don't see a scenario where that's actually what it takes. I think he's going to be an Oriole. Yeah, but there are other teams also.
The Reds make a lot of sense for him too. Like,
not so much. They've added a lot of pitching, but sure, they could certainly, like, if you're the Reds and you have all this pitching, you could be like, hey, you want Graham Ashcraft and Noel V. Marte? Yeah, and like, the Mariners can't compete with that.
Well, and the Reds have added pitching, yes, but they haven't added anything close to what Dylan Cease could be. So
could be, sure,
yeah.
But the Reds are also a mid-market team who have spent a lot of money for their standards this offseason already. So we'll see. like I said, I'm a big fan of the screw you pitching staff idea. I think
Yep. Nice.
I think if there's anything I've ever championed that has been like outside the norm, it's been that idea to just go all in on pitching this winter. So I'm certainly interested in Cease. I just don't see a path to a deal unless it's pure prospects, and that's all the White Sox want, because you're going to get outbid pretty easily by a team like Baltimore, and Baltimore, I think, has exactly the type of pitcher or exactly the type of players that Chicago would want right now based on where they're at. So I'm interested. I just think you're going to get outbid pretty easily and pretty quickly. So
yeah.
I don't see it.
Yeah. So sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I don't think Dylan Cease is going to be a Seattle Mariner. Just going out on a limb there. But hey, you never know. Maybe, we always say this when it comes to trades, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So maybe just straight up, the White Sox like the Mariners group of prospects more than the Orioles.
If you want upside prospects and you're willing to wait a couple of years, the Mariners top 5 is better than what the Orioles could offer you. But if you want impact now, like guys who can help you right now, Seattle can't compete with that. So yeah, it's all about what do the White Sox want. Well,
that's going to do it for our show. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. For Colby Patnode, I'm Ty Dane Gonzalez. Be sure to give us a follow on Twitter at LO_Mariners. You can follow me at Ty Dane Gonzalez and Colby at CPAT11. That's CPAT11. You can also find all that stuff in the description of this episode. Thank you again for making us your first listen. Have yourself a beautiful baseball day. We'll see you next time. Peace.